Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm told it's exactly 5 o'clock, so probably time to start. Welcome to all of you who have joined us in person here at Room W in the World Trade Organization for the 2023 WTO Public Forum. And because this session is also being live streamed, welcome to those of you who are joining us online. This promises to be probably one of the most interesting sessions you've heard. My name is Alice Tipping. I am the Director for Trade and Sustainable Development at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We're a think tank based in Canada, but we have a large office here in Geneva, from which I lead a superb team of talented professionals doing work on the intersection of trade policy and environment and social issues. It's a great honor to be invited to moderate this session, which is co-organized by the EU and by the government of Kenya, to focus specifically on questions around the green transition and to bring both EU and African perspectives to this question. So we're going to talk about the efforts and experiences of the green transition in two very different contexts in the EU and in Kenya. We're going to talk about the role of trade policy in facilitating that green transition, and we're going to talk a little bit about how cooperation between governments can help to facilitate that transition and to share perspectives on it. So we're going to bring together both the perspectives of two representatives of those governments. We're delighted to have Maria Martin Prat, who's the Deputy Director General at the European Commission in DG Trade. We're delighted also to have Dennis Buhambe, who is a councillor at the permanent mission of Kenya to the United Nations and to the World Trade Organization. And Dennis is replacing his ambassador, who is unfortunately unwell today. So Dr. Cleopa is on all of our thoughts, and we hope he feels better very soon. So we'll hear from the two very different government perspectives on that transition and how it's been experienced in each country. And then we're going to hear from the perspective of somebody who follows government efforts and follows government policies and supports them very closely. And that's Dr. Kaifas Chikwati, who is the head of Center of Trade Policy of the Trade Policy Training Center in Africa, TRAPCA, which is based in Tanzania. So Dr. Kaifas, thank you very much indeed for joining us. So we're going to start with a couple of rounds of questions. I'll try and keep it relatively light and relatively conversational. I'll be asking Ms. Martin Prat and also Mr. Buhambe about the EU and Kenya's experiences in the green transition, also talking about how aspects of EU-Kenyan collaboration and specific instruments can help to alleviate the pressure of changes that domestic regulation can bring on trading partners. And then I'm going to turn to Dr. Kaifas to talk a little bit about sort of the broader overview of supporting governments through policy reform, right? Helping policymakers who often have to deal with a number of different issues to follow the questions that are coming up, and to think and talk about the challenges and needs for policy support that the green transition brings to bear. Because of course, it's if climate change is one of the defining challenges of our generation, managing that process through regulation is one of the defining challenges of this generation of policymakers. And many of you are in the room now and watching us online. So I'm going to run a couple of rounds of relatively quick interventions, and then I'm happy to open the floor to others to see if we have questions or comments. So I might perhaps first turn to you, Maria, if you allow me, to talk to us a little bit about the EU Green Deal, but with a specific focus on the energy transition and how that experience has been run from the Commission's perspective, but with a sort of Europe-wide perspective on the issue, and how the Commission thinks about the impacts of its regulatory changes on trading partners. Go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here and to be sitting to give together with Kenya our views on what you very rightly said is probably not only a challenge for all of us as citizens, but also a challenge for those of us that are working in public policy and dealing with regulation. I think the starting point, which I am sure, or I hope many of you will share, is that we do have to work not only to address the challenge that we are facing with climate change, but also to use it as an opportunity for a better development and a better way to organize our economic relations. We have all taken very ambitious goals in the Paris Agreement. We have also demonstrated high ambition, for instance, in December in the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We keep working on the multilateral environment agreements that tackle pollution. In other words, we know what we need to do, but then translating these into the right policies, and not only domestically, or in the case of the European Union at the European Union level, but also at international level, and ensuring that we avoid frictions in our relations with other countries is as important as it can sometimes be challenging. Now, on our side, we have made in the last 4 years a very, very determined push. And we have put a lot of focus on the production and use of energy, because in the end, energy accounts for more than 75% of the green gas emissions that we produce in Europe. And we have therefore done what I would qualify as a significant overhaul of our legislative framework. I'm not going to get into details, but we have put on the table a very ambitious package that we refer to as Fit for 55 package that includes measures that aim at tackling greenhouse gas emissions and accelerate the energy transition, tries to encourage the deployment of renewable energy and to increase energy efficiency, and also obviously establishes what we consider to be key incentive structures, such as emission trading, taxation, and the prevention of carbon leakage. We have also, by the way, and we're very active in trying to preserve and grow the natural carbon sinks. In other words, restoring our forests and the soils and wetlands and peatlands that we can restore in Europe. We are also supporting very quickly the transition away from fossil fuels. And that includes as well what we have referred to as a Green Deal industrial plan. So we're really pushing on all the fronts that we have in, again, what I think is a level of ambition that is probably unseen in terms of legislation and compromises made. Now, we are perfectly aware of the fact that this is not something that we can do alone. And we're also perfectly aware of the fact that we need to be mindful that our actions go along with the actions of others and may have consequences as regards those others, and the other way around is also true. So we are in that front, not only making sure that our rules are non-discriminatory, are WTO compatible, and we're making a very, very clear effort to ensure that, but we are also actively reaching out to others, trying to minimize the impacts that our legislation may have on trade and investment. We are engaging with third-country partners throughout the chain of legislation, from the moment of inception to the deployment and implementation of rules, from the public consultations that we've had at the stages of preparation of legislation, to now very actively in key legislation, engaging with countries to work with them as well to ensure that there is clarity and cooperation to the largest extent possible in the implementation of rules when those rules have an effect on others. And that includes guidelines, that includes tables, groups where we have specific discussions with the specific countries on the specific issues. That also involves supporting capacity building and helping other countries. I think, stop at this for now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really helpful. And I think it probably speaks to the weight of legislative reform that you've described, I mean, certainly speaks to the weight of reform required, right? And a specific focus on the energy sector, which if I wrote it down correctly, contributes 35% of the EU's emissions. 75, even greater. And I think it's for those of us who are or have been policymakers, we all understand just the level of bureaucratic and political effort required to move significant legislative changes through all of that process. I wanted perhaps, Mr. Buhambe, if I can turn to you. Can you walk us through Kenya's own energy transition, how you've experienced it, what the challenges have been, how it seemed, at least from the Kenyan government's perspective? Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Alice. It's a pleasure to be here to represent my ambassador and share our perspectives on energy transition, particularly moving towards green transition. As Maria said, all members of the UNFCCC have made commitments under their nationally determined contributions, and Kenya has committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by the year 2030. And one of the sectors that we think will help us reach this target is electricity generation. Generally, Kenya's electricity is produced from renewable energy sources, which is a good thing because that makes the beginning of transition easier for us. The current installed capacity of electricity in Kenya is 3,600 megawatts, and it's growing because we have an ambition to become industrialized, highly industrialized middle-income country by 2030. So we are looking at the demand for energy going to up to 15,000 megawatts by then. And therefore, we need to plan for that. And thankfully, we have a lot of green energy resources that we can use to produce this electricity. So currently, the generation mix comprises of hydropower, which from the 3,600 megawatts, we produce about 867 megawatts of hydropower from hydropower. We also have geothermal that is growing in terms of capacity. Currently, we produce about 953 megawatts from geothermal. We have wind. One of the biggest wind farms in Africa is in Kenya. And currently, it contributes 436 megawatts to the national grid. We also have invested heavily in solar, and that also, in terms of investment, we're growing it. So far, we are producing about 266 megawatts of electricity from solar. And there's also a small fraction of our electricity that we produce from biomass, particularly bagasse, that is the waste product of sugar. And that is about 90 megawatts at the moment. And then the remainder of this electricity, produce it through fossil fuels, petroleum. We use diesel quite a bit to produce electricity. We also use coal. We have some deposits of coal in Kenya. And this is mainly in the manufacturing, heavy manufacturing sectors, that is cement, particularly cement and steel manufacturing. And part of this energy intensive produces what we call waste heat that is used to generate electricity. And currently, this waste captive waste capacity is about 83.5 megawatts. So that is where we are in terms of electricity production. Last year, 87% of our electricity was generated from green resources. That was last year. This year is predicted to be more, to be higher. We are looking at about 90%, and we are looking at by 2030 to have 100% of our electricity generated from green energy. So that's the target. Hopefully by then we'll also beat the target of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. So coming back to the household, I mean, of course, we use electricity for many things, including houses. But in Kenya, the practice is cooking, which contributes a lot, of energy. It uses a lot of energy. We mostly use gas for cooking and wood fuels. Of course, gas is a fossil fuel. In the rural areas, we have a lot of demand for wood fuel, which of course has its impact on the climate. So in terms of electricity usage in the houses, we mostly use it for lighting, but for cooking, we use gas and wood fuel because of the cost of electricity. So gas is a bit cheaper. Wood also is a bit cheaper and readily available in the rural areas. And of course, not all households have power, so that in rural areas we don't have that power. Therefore, the option is to use wood fuel for cooking. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, we also have a lot of demand for fossil fuels. The transport sector in Kenya, we uses a lot of fossil fuels, road transportation. consumes about 75% of our fossil fuels. We import most of our petroleum, and 75% of that goes for transportation. The remainder goes to, of course, air transportation. And there's a growing demand for fossil fuels for railway transportation. We introduced a couple of years ago the standard gauge railway, which has both cargo and passenger freight. And there's growing demand for fossil fuel because of the frequency of this railway. So of course, in terms of electricity production, we are doing quite a bit. We are doing well in terms of the transition, but the demand for fossil fuel is growing, and because of the growing population, and of course our aspiration to industrialize. So that justifies the demand for petroleum. So in a nutshell, that is our experience in terms of green transition. Yeah.
And maybe just to come back to some of those numbers, I mean, the objective of growth is astronomical, right? From 3,500 megawatts now to about 15,000 by 2030. And to combine that with a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, would be a hugely tall order for most countries. But it seems, though, that you're already relatively well placed, right? If some 90% of the electricity comes already from green sources, in other greater experts than I in the room may be able to tell me how unique that is, but it sounds like quite a uniquely and well-positioned place for Kenya to be. But I think that the growth in demand from transport for fossil fuels is interesting, right? Because of course, the more income people have, the more they will wish to engage in transport, to move around the country for jobs. Cities grow, the demand for cars grows. So that might be an interesting question to come back to, how that might be managed as well. Perhaps Dr. Chikwoti, I'll turn to you now, because the question to you, I think, is almost sort of a really broad one, but one I think that speaks to your experience. What we hoped you could talk to us about is the particular challenges that developing country governments face in building policy frameworks that combine both environment and industrialization and trade objectives. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience of the kinds of challenges developing country governments face? And I'm interested in hearing in particular how your institute helps them to overcome that. So feel free to do as much self-promotion at this point as you wish, because I would like to hear about it. Go ahead.
No, thank you so much, Alice. And it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation, which I believe is quite interesting. It's very clear from what we have heard from our colleagues that yes, the EU is able to easily make that transition. Yes, they have the commitment, but to make the transition and the progress they've made, they have to have capabilities. And we heard from our brother from Kenya, yes, you can see where the cork is still quite stuck. Transportation. Yeah. So what one could just say, what to borrow from the experience of the EU, and then we're looking at that transition also shifting to electrifying the transport sector. So we have standard gauge rail. Then the next step would be to actually have electrified trains. Yeah. Now, which then would link up with the transition towards greener production of electricity. Yeah. But in between that mix is a tall order, like you remarked, because it requires capabilities. Yeah. And capabilities here could be so broad. First of all, technical expertise to be able to craft strategies that slowly will redirect resources towards needed investments. In a number of cases, it's lacking. But even if that could be available, you find that it is isolated. Now, there's one thing that I've observed in a number of cases, which appears to be a major stumbling block, and that is the silo operations. Yeah, I think my brother will attest to that, that even among our government entities, there's a lot of this is my turf. These are my resources. This is how I operate. And then we're looking at the issue we're discussing about today, that is cross-cutting. It requires some kind of interoperability, working together and all that kind of stuff. But we still have a big challenge there. And that creates a lot of bureaucracy. You mentioned something about overcoming bureaucracy by the EU. But from the perspective of most of the African countries, maybe it's a little bit different from Kenya, but there's a lot of bureaucracy with government agencies coming together and the different organs of government are kind of coming together to be able to push the agenda and redirect resources, shape the way the threat is mainstreamed within not only environment, but also fiscal policy and all that, because then at the end of the day, the bottom line is on resources. So I see that as a major stumbling block. But you see, something connected to that, and from where I sit and our interaction with the a number of the key stakeholders, it's easy to expect that when we talk about some of the opportunities from trade, how we can harness trade instruments, for example, to be able now to push through this kind of transition that we want. And there's a general expectation that everybody understands what trade is, how trade works. Even within the government agencies that are supposed to push this, that understanding is very limited. And that in itself presents a significant challenge. If you don't have a clear grasp on how the world architecture, the rules that govern trade, then present opportunities. Somehow your interest may be dampened. Now, what if you are this government official who then has some key decision power and you don't have that clear understanding? What happens? It means then you go to put a block on something, on progress that, so I think that's an area that could be a little bit more. Of course, there could be differences across African countries, but somehow worse than that. So I see that as a major challenge. And of course, later, as we shall discuss, that's a capacity issue. And then it links up to capabilities, to be able to really understand this. So for me, I see that quickly as big issues, but then something we all of course are familiar. There are always resource constraints. To make this transition, we need resources. We have to make investments. And there are always resource constraints. I think the discussion that we've had since Tuesday has been, access to financing and all that, right? Most of the African countries face dilemmas. So they need export revenue, for example. Now, that export revenue could mean that then they have to boost, for example, their exports. And the exports, given the current status where manufacturing is still quite limited, are likely to be primary products. So if the agricultural products that will compete with the, for example, the interventions that would green, for example, agriculture, say, need for more agricultural land to produce commercial export crops, for example, would mean an increase in deforestation. Yes, and governments, they need the revenue. So those kind of dilemmas, those are policy dilemmas. And then even if you look at the extractive sector, yes, it still has its ugly side. The more extraction, the likelihood is that there will be environmental damage within the mining areas. But the governments need the revenue. So you see those kind of policy dilemmas. So I see that as a key dimension. Now that we're talking about electricity as really key in this green transition, because it's energy at the end of the day, there are, of course, efforts like we've had, but there's also an issue of scale. So if you're looking at investments into renewable, cleaner electricity generation, at national level, a number of these economies may be too small to really attract significant investments. So that would speak to the reality that in a number of the countries, there's still very limited electricity trade across the countries. Yeah, which actually would boost the scale. So a regional setup, yes, there are efforts and initiatives towards power pools and so forth, which would be quite useful. But then there's another connected challenge. The infrastructure for the grid and transmission and so forth is still quite deficient, to the extent that then the energy losses, just moving that power from one place to another, are significant. Yeah, so then if you're looking at the possibility to scale up, it would then require massive investments to make it feasible that then you can have regional trading of electricity. And then that attracts investments, which would easily address the resource constraint. So I see that as really key. Then there's something interesting, which of course has also come out quite clearly. Other than energy, renewables is a subject of manufacturing economics. Yeah. So it's not that you just go and extract. You have to produce the products. You have to produce the batteries. You have to produce the solar panels. You have to produce the wind turbines. You have to manufacture them. Yeah. But now when we look at the African countries, manufacturing, we're still struggling. Yeah, we're still struggling. And so, and that again immediately presents just this massive challenge. I like the way you made the observation. It's under a tall order, the shift, because it requires that to be in place. So, and you immediately can connect that with the, of course, what my brother raised about transportation heavily relying on fossil fuels, yes, because then there's a whole balance and a balancing act with respect to immediate energy needs. Yes, and we've seen, I think Kenya has been going through that, witnessing instances where, yes, the cost of living then dramatically is driven up, arising from the increased cost of fuel at the pump. Yeah, and so now you're then more likely to find that the policymakers will get caught up within that dimension. Okay, how do we address an immediate challenge? Because then that might have political pressures. So you can see a number of these challenges that then immediately feature within that. Then, of course, for me, there's the issue of human capacity, infrastructure, finance, and a number of that, I think, has been part of the conversation that we've been hearing since. So that is really the known. But then, yes, electricity generation through hydro, for example. Yeah, for countries that find that they have that kind of resource, there's also another challenge. Some of these resources are transboundary. Yeah. So, I mean, probably a number of us are familiar with the challenge between Ethiopia and Egypt with respect to utilizing the Nile waters and to be able to then boost the green energy generation. So, and yeah, okay, that's good. So I wanted to highlight those now. So where do we then come in as a center and as an institution, a SAMI, which is owned by 10 African countries, into the picture as all this? If you listen to me, you will then see that the bottom line is on capabilities, and human capabilities, human capacity, and the capacity gaps are significant. And that's where we put our energies. And what then we've been doing as a SAMI is craft a number of products that address these capacity needs at various levels. So we have one that builds competence, advanced competence at the master's level, just to ensure that officials, the majority of them are government officials, who go through the program get a clear understanding on the nitty-gritty about trade issues. Yeah, that allows them to be able to articulate policies, guide our decision makers, and we've seen that working. Yeah, we've seen that working. But then we also have targeted, short, solution-oriented kind of products, trade covering a whole area of trade dimensions. That then we are now responding to specific needs, engaging institutions, working with institutions, with the ministries, and then trying to understand their needs and respond to that. What we have also observed is there are cases when you discover that you don't have a beneficiary may not be so clear on what their capacity gaps are. Yeah, they may think it is this, but when you engage with them, you discover, oh, it is something else. Yeah, so that's something that we're doing as a summit tracker, and we're covering the whole continent, more or less, 52 African countries. Yeah. So basically, that's what I want to share at this.
That's super interesting. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll come back to the question of what can be done to help build the increasing capacity building that you're doing. Maria, I wanted to come back to you. I mean, the next question on the agenda is about the EU's engagement with its trading partners and specific examples of the EU-Kenya agreement and your bilateral work. But I also heard you agreeing with kind of general comments on the panel about how difficult sometimes it is to break down silos within bureaucracies. So without revealing any house secrets about how the Commission functions, if you had anything that you wanted to share about how the Commission's tried to establish systems or to change the way it works to try and meet the huge objective and the huge target that your politicians have set for you, we'd be interested in hearing that too. So to the extent you can speak to that, I'd be interested. But feel free to stick to the agreed question, which is about the EU-Kenya arrangements. Go ahead.
I think I can very quickly try to touch upon each of the points. And on the breaking of silos, which I absolutely agree, that is not that different whether it happens at national level or at the level of an organization of economic integration as the European Union is. You need to put in place the mechanisms that allow to coordinate and to arbitrate, because arbitrations are needed. So in the same manner that you may have a minister in charge of finances and a minister in charge of environment and another one in charge of energy and another one in charge of transport, you have commissioners, which is the equivalent for us of ministers, and you do have to have those efforts that are coordinated. I mean, normally it helps if you have a common goal, and normally that gets defined at the highest level of an, in our case, the Commission. In the case of Kenya, I can already say part of the success that we had, and I'll speak about it in a minute in the conclusion of our EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, or the driver, came all the way from the level of your president in Kenya, whose commitment to supporting the policies required to address climate change and deforestation is extremely clear and was articulated all the way in his discussions with my minister, with Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. So in that respect, silos is a problem we all have to handle. Now, in terms, just going back a little bit to trade, coming to the issue more from the trade angle, what I think we need to do, and it's something that I know has been discussed here throughout these 2 days, 3 days, and the different sessions, we need to see how we can ensure that trade tools also accompany what different African countries are doing, what we're trying to do in the European Union. And for us, this happens a lot at our levels. At multilateral level, the main thing from our point of view is to make the WTO more relevant in the discussion, is to mainstream climate and environment as part of the objectives that we need to achieve when establishing a framework for trade to continue, because trade is going to continue, but to do it in a sustainable manner. There are discussions and efforts happening in this house in a very active manner in the last years, both at multilateral and plurilateral level. And I think it is also very, very important, and we are using it as much as we can to use the fora for more transparency. We have subject ourselves to a high degree of transparency and scrutiny. It's not always easy, I can tell you, but it's part of the game, and you have to accept it if you are making an effort that has the effect it can have in terms of discussions and trade. Is very, very important that you explain what you're doing, why you are doing it, and ensure that it functions as well as it can, not only for you, but also for the others. Part of the breaking silos is something we're also trying to do with the Coalition of Trade Ministers for Climate. And they are, Kenya is one of the co-leads, together with Ecuador, with New Zealand, and with the European Union. And it's precisely, the coalition is precisely about breaking silos and making sure that if there is a need to push or take difficult decisions, you're involved at the political level. That's why, if you want, sometimes you get the question, what is the added value? What is it different from the efforts that we are already undertaking in the organization? Is to put the ministers there. And it's also, which is one of the directions we are working on, is to, for instance, put the trade ministers to talk with the finance ministers. So that is indeed a silos breaking attempt, which is very important. We have so far 58 trade ministers, and we cover members of the WTO from all regions and from all levels of development. From Africa, we have 7 members, and obviously, I think I can say with confidence that Kenya, the other conveners, including ourselves, would like to enlarge that group as much as we can. And then it's quite interesting when going to the discussion about dilemmas. We all face dilemmas. Some, depending on the circumstances, may face bigger dilemmas or different dilemmas. And one of the dilemmas is related to trade and how to make it more sustainable. There again, we have been making huge efforts in terms of trade and sustainable development. Also mainstreaming the provisions in our trade agreements that can support sustainability, including by taking binding commitments as regards the respect of standards not only related to climate and environment, but also to labor. I must say that the IPA that we have concluded with Kenya, it is incredibly ambitious. And in that respect, I think it has to be recognized for this specific value. It's an example of how you can have that level of ambition between the European Union and an African partner. And it leads me to a point that I think is important as well. We were discussing it in another panel now. Very often when we talk about trade and the negative effects of trade, one really is talking about exports and imports. But the very important part of trade is investment. The investment that everybody needs, not only African countries, might be degrees, but everybody needs, because I think you were saying as well, for the green transition, you're going to have to have your solar panels. You're going to have your wind turbines. You're going to have your batteries. No one has everything. There are many advantages también. Also, sorry, I was jumping into Spanish. In some of the, for instance, raw materials that many African countries have. So they are a well understood trade that includes sustainability and sustainable investment, and that's something we're putting a lot of emphasis. Also with other African partners is something that, from my point of view, is very important. I can stop there.
Super. Thank you very much. Maybe Dr. Muhammad, Mr. Muhammad, forgive me, Councillor. Too many doctors on this panel. I wanted maybe to come back to a specific trade-off that we came across as we were thinking and talking to each other about preparing this session. And I think, in fact, Dr. Kaifas has already spoken about it already a little bit, right? So the slightly difficult question I wanted to put to you and have your perspective on is whether there is, either in the narrative or in the reality, a trade-off between the transition to green energy and Africa's industrialization objectives. Because as Dr. Kaifas was saying, that there is often a tension in how those problems are presented. And the question perhaps is that just a problem of presentation, do you think? Is it a real problem? Are there ways to get around it? It's a difficult question, but see what you think.
Well, thank you for that question. I think if you've been following discussions at the WTO, there's always this mantra about Africa that we need policy space for industrialization. And therefore, whatever we discuss, whatever outcomes we make, we must keep in mind that we want to industrialize, and we need that policy space to industrialize. So it's true that we want to move to a level to advance economically. In Kenya, for example, we have an ambition to become a newly industrialized middle-income country by 2030. And we are looking at enablers that will help us propel to that level, one of which is manufacturing. And we see energy as another very important enabler for us to move to that level. Manufacturing right now contributes very little to our GDP. And the target is that by 2030, manufacturing will contribute at least 15% of our GDP. And as I said earlier, there are players in the manufacturing sector that are heavy users of fossil fuels, steel industry, cement. And therefore, even as we look to transition, they'll be affected one way or the other. So I think, we have to strike a balance between our commitments to mitigate the effects of climate change and environmental concerns on one hand, and our industrialization ambition. So I see we have to balance that. The other thing is that in Kenya, we have huge deposits of coal. We also have deposits of oil and gas, and explorations have been going on in terms of viability. And of course, the coal is what the heavy users of fossil fuel use to produce the energy, the cement factories and the steel factories. So if we are to look at, we are moving towards green energy, and we have this, what we consider assets. So we are staring at a situation where we have stranded assets that we cannot monetize. And the question is, one, even as we move towards green energy, in terms of electricity, the demand for fossil fuels in the transport sector isn't increasing. It's not going to reduce. So the question is, should we let this asset be stranded at the expense of importing petrol, or should we find better ways of using that asset? So I think those are the questions that we ask ourselves, so that even as we move we move to implement and fulfill our commitments internationally, we are faced with this reality that here we export 100% of our fossil fuels, and we have fossil fuels that we can explore. So what do we do with that? On one hand, even as we move towards fulfilling our international commitments.
Not easy decisions for policymakers at all, or for politicians. And as you mentioned, steel and cement and the inputs that go into them, I can think of a number of policies coming down the pipeline that might encourage the use of green energy in their production, and I'll leave it at that. Dr. Chipwati, perhaps I can talk to turn to you at this moment, because we've been talking about the need to help policymakers in developing countries think through these trade-offs that you've articulated and that Mr. Muhammad has as well. We've been thinking about, you've articulated extremely well the particular capacity challenges that all policymakers have, right? And Maria has spoken to them as well, I think. But the question that I wanted to ask you, and it is another self-serving question probably from your perspective, what can donor countries, donor governments do to help support the kind of capacity building that you do to develop more, to develop capacities in developing country governments to build more coherent policy? Is there enough attention on the policy and the regulatory capacity building part of your work, do you think? Does there need to be more? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very good question. And the reality, the short answer is no. We seriously need to scale it up. Yeah, the capacity gaps are just huge. That's significant. I mean, if you look at it from a national level, you're looking at several stakeholders. Stakeholders who make that, those in government, the technocrats, the policymakers, the parliamentarians, there's the private sector, and also the different categories of the private sector with different needs. So that's several stakeholders. Yeah, and we need to get to that stage where, at the very least, they understand how trade works, where the opportunity is, how they can extract that opportunity, how they can turn it into something that then aligns with their interest. In that way, we're more likely to break this resistance. Yes, because a number of times could also be limited understanding. So currently, yes, we're doing with the what we've been graciously supported by the Swedish government, and then complementing that with the engagements with the respective institutions and entities that can pay. Yeah, but it's always a challenge. It's always a challenge to scale that. The demand is very high. And for us, we can see that even interacting. It's actually interesting that even among those who you will expect to really be conversant about some of the things. Technically, they like it. We had an engagement with the 19 African countries, supporting the negotiators on the AFCFTA, the Continental Agreement, first two issues on investment, IP, e-commerce, and so forth. And we're dealing with negotiators. And what did we discover? Technically, they have a number of gaps, and these are negotiators. So, and you can imagine what that means. So to us, if we can be supported, already we're doing a good thing. And we've seen the impact. The impact is actually self-revealing, but it will take a little bit too long for us to reach where we can say now we have that pool that can trigger that transformation. So if we can be able to get resources to scale that up and have different interventions to bridge the capacity gaps across all these key stakeholders across the continent. And there, of course, there are specific aspects that we need. We're looking at all these emerging issues now. The move to green transition, we have digitalization, digital trade, and automation, all that. All that is changing so many things. It's changing even the existing rules, and requires, and that even exacerbates the capacity gaps. So we will need that support. Yeah, we'll need that support to scale it up. Currently, we are we're able to try to provide our interventions in English and French, at least to cater for the greater part of the key languages in the continent. But we also have the Lusophone. Yeah, we also, and we need to be able to address the specific needs. Yeah, but even within the English speaking, we've just scratched the surface. Yeah, so for me, that's number one. If we can be able to get, and interestingly, addressing capacity issues does not actually require a lot of money. I mean, relative to, for example, the amounts of money that were exactly. Yeah, so it is I would say long in front, but it has impact. Yeah, it has impact. So for me, it's that's key. And I could also see, and I like the aspect to do with the investment, because that's actually key. And what came into my mind is, yes, there are a number of African countries that are actually resource rich with critical minerals, for example, that fit into the production of the components and eventually, of course, the products that are part and parcel of the green, the renewables. And so we also need to think about the renewable value chain, yeah, and think along a regional setup. Yeah, and that would require then to build capacity to make that happen. Yeah, and requires a lot of investments to make that happen. And it becomes a win-win. If that can be done in Africa, a number of these products could easily then become cheaply produced, because then the key raw materials, logistically and geographically close, that would benefit the rest of the world. Yeah, and so that's also another dimension from a business perspective. Yeah, there's something that I recalled having a conversation with one of the experts who is a green economy expert, supporting South African companies to actually green their businesses. And he said there was something interesting about it, in the sense that they picked interest to green their businesses because it made business sense. They saved money. The profit margin widened. So just by greening, redesigning the heating systems and using more energy efficient lighting systems and so forth, they were able to increase their margin. So it made businesses, and that was a bigger motivation. So we also have to think a little bit more creatively on how we draw funding and investments towards the renewables. So that's something I could see, but it's clear capacity is still a big challenge, and we need a lot of that support. We're only being currently supported by the gracious by the government of Sweden through SIDA, but I think we can do more, and it becomes win-win. Yeah, thank you very much.
No, that's really interesting. And in particular, a few things, well, 3 points. Firstly, the fact that if I understood you correctly, the focus is capacity building, not just for policymakers, but across the different stakeholders who need to be involved in the policymaking process. And that frankly hadn't occurred to me properly, because the alternative is you build government officials' ability to explain the issues, but then if they have to then go out and convince firstly educate all of their stakeholders and then get their input, it's a whole extra step. Secondly, the rise of the new issues and the ability of government officials and stakeholders to cover them. I mean, many of you will have been aware, having sat here for almost a week, that the WTO now has within its walls 3 new informal environment initiatives. 2 of those environment initiatives have 4 working groups each, which is a huge amount of discussions for any delegate to follow, let alone the government official back in Capitol who's supposed to be providing input and positions to the delegate sitting here. So there's I think a huge need to help government officials think through these new issues. And the very last point is that it's a relatively low cost, high impact kind of investment, right? I mean, you're training people. Yes, it's a long-term job, but the impact, and I was talking to one of our funders about this just earlier, what's interesting about the impact is that it is essentially concretized in regulation and in laws and in treaties, right? So the impact actually frames the whole regulatory framework that governments and policymakers and businesses then work to. So that's extremely interesting. I have let the speakers talk because they have been so interesting, but we do have a decent amount of time for questions and comments from the floor. So if there's anything you'd like to ask, you don't have to pretend that your comment is a question. You can just make a comment. Yes, I have one in the middle. Is there anything else? Otherwise, no. And please let us know who you are. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Stephanie Rickard. I'm a professor at the London School of Economics. Maria, I was very interested about what you said about getting finance ministers involved. And I wonder if you think the interests of finance ministers and trade ministers are aligned in the green transition, thinking about green transition subsidies, Or do you see them coming into conflict with one another? Is there a role for finance ministers to dial back green subsidies? Is that the dynamics or the incentives that they have? Thank you.
Super question. Probably the 21st time I've heard subsidies mentioned this week, which just proves how top of the agenda they are. Anything else until now? No? Maria, would you like to have a go at that difficult question?
Yes, it's it's a difficult one. Interesting enough, from the chair I sit, I have an executive vice president who is responsible for trade and economic affairs. So that helps. It also helps the fact in our case that from the beginning of this commission, the clear priorities that were defined for the commission as presented by its president were the green and the digital transition. So in a way, you do have, if you want, your marching orders, although obviously within those marching orders, there's always a huge amount of space to interpret and to adjust. So I think I'm not pretending that the coalition, by putting this conversation together, is going to directly and immediately have an effect that we will see, for instance, as regards, I don't know, subsidy for fossil fuels that you may have in mind. But it does help. It does have an effect. I've seen that happening in a number of discussions already, also in the area of investment. So in that respect, it might be seen as a maybe high-level political general framework, but I think it's quite fundamental.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Maria. Dennis has wisely avoided that hot potato question. But Dr. Kaifas would like to have a go. How do you see it from an African perspective, the trade and the finance ministers' discussion, particularly on the green transition question? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I think for me, I would still go back to the renewables value chain. What do finance ministers want? They want to be able to drive the fiscal policy to grow the economy, generate revenue, and if then, and I could see the challenge, whether you have subsidies, for example, for fossil fuels and stuff like that. If then finance ministers can see that there is likely to be a shift, it may take a little bit of time, a little bit of investment, but if the renewables value chain can be supported for countries, for example, that already have the critical raw materials to make the different components and then the products, which then are part of the renewable value chain. That the finance ministers can easily see that they will start having products that are part of the renewables value chain that actually will bring in money at the end of the day. Yeah, it will bring in forex, they'll be able to export, and that will address the immediate challenge. So it is more about, of course, part of negotiation and clearly articulating where the benefit will be, how long that will be, what kind of resources will be required to transition to that. So then the ministers can be in a position to see, okay, with the current budget constraint, how do we gradually move towards that? Yeah, what kind of recourse should we be looking at that could allow us to probably handle both and scaling the other one, the renewables, over time. So for me, I see there's a possibility. It just requires more conversation around it. Yeah, between this, and that's also part of breaking the silo. Okay, thank you.
And I think, in fact, Dr. Chikwata, what you seem to be talking about is, in fact, helping ministers to see their common objectives, right? Where the trade minister and the finance minister's objectives for their portfolios intersect, and helping to bring that creativity perhaps to the discussion might help. Any other questions before I had one perhaps last one for Maria. It's 6 o'clock, I know. I'm going to end then. Last call. I'm going to end with the very last question, Maria, if you don't mind. I wondered, I mean, you talked about how innovative the EU-Kenya EPA was. Can you, which as a trade policy practitioner, I found fascinating. Can you give us a little bit more detail or depth or color about how the EU and Kenyan relationship has been built, and perhaps what the significance of the EPA is for building other ways of cooperating between the two governments?
I'm happy to do that. The EPA, by the way, the negotiations have been concluded at the level of President Ruto from Kenya, and on our side, now we are in the process of going towards the ratification of the agreement in our respective systems. But why is it important? Traditionally, we do have relations with a number of African countries based either on trade agreements, which basically focus on trading goods and then a development cooperation. Otherwise, we obviously also have a very important relation because we do have a very strong way to open our markets for those countries which are least developed and developing on the basis of the general system of preferences. So that also is a framework for trade in a very, if you want, unilateral manner in terms of opening our markets. But to me, I think it's quite obvious that we're talking about agreements that reflected a reality where you think, okay, you are going to be able to sell our goods, your goods in our market, and that's going to help you. And I think the reality is far more complex at the moment. I think the facilitation of trade through investment is extremely important. We are engaging, and this is not only with Kenya, for instance, we've done it as well with Angola in what we call CFAS, you know, the taste of trade people, to give names, acronym to everything, sustainable investment facilitation agreements, which really are not about you open your market and I open mine. It's about let's have clear, predictable, transparent regulation that helps you attracting those that can have investment, so you do move up your value chains. But then going back to the Kenya agreement, what we did with the modernization was to include a very strong sustainable development angle. And that sustainable development angle includes principles which are very important, but that maybe are not always easy to convince other countries. And this can also be other developed countries, such as, for instance, we will not regress. We are not going to lower the levels of protections that we have adopted on the basis not only of international obligations, but also our domestic regulation. We will not lower our stance of protection in order to attract trade or attract investment. So you have a country like Kenya that says, yes, this is important. I don't want to have an investment on the basis of having less protection. Again, when we talk about sustainable development, we do not only work on the basis of our objectives for climate, but also environment and labor. But that is maybe out of this discussion here. We've made the Paris Agreement an essential element in our economic partnership agreement. And I think there we also see the EPA as the basis to go further in terms of facilitation of investment going forward. But to me, what I thought was really very impressive when I participated, I was not in the negotiations, teams working with me were But then when I saw the interaction and discussions between my commissioner, the Kenyan trade minister, the Kenyan president, at least at that level, the objective was very clear. We want trade, but we want sustainability. And it was very, very clearly articulated as to what the consequences of climate change have already brought into the country and why this needs to change. This doesn't mean that this is easy, and the tensions will be there and the difficult choices. And I think you were very clear in how you explain your needs and how easy or not it is, and also the stranded assets is a real challenge for any government in any country. But anyways, that's why we think we see it as a model, and CERTA is the most ambitious in terms of sustainability agreement that we have with an African country.
Super. Thank you very much. Thank you for indulging me with my own personal question. I wanted to make sure, Dennis, Dr. Kaifas, if you wanted any last comments, now is your chance. Otherwise, I'll move to someone.
Well, I think from the discussion, and Dr. Chikoti has put it clearly, the biggest challenge that we have in Africa is capacity. And if you look at our obligations and SDG 7 about access to clean and affordable energy, I mean, if you are to monitor how we are faring on in terms of meeting this SDG, many countries are lagging behind. And the challenge is capacity. And one of the things that has happened recently, we had the inaugural Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi a couple of days ago. And the presidents in their declaration, they recognize that we have an obligation to decarbonize, but we need assistance, and the assistance is in terms of finances and technology. In the declaration, it was noted that almost 40% of world renewable energy resources are in Africa. But then investment in these renewables in Africa is just 2% over the last 10 years. So there's been about $3 trillion being invested in renewables in the world, but only 2% of that has trickled to Africa, or 60 billion. So if you compare that kind of investment and the kind of potential, they don't match. So the call was to the international community that, of course, looking at Africa's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, which again is minimal. But then with all this potential, there's need to look at how we can harness our green energy potential to help not just the continent, but the world large meet the what they call the targets to reduce greenhouse gas emission to net zero by 2050. So I think the message is that there's a lot of potential, but there's need for finances and technology. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Kaifas, last words.
Well, thank you so much. And I think there has been a record. Yes, capacity, and we've seen that. Yeah, like I was saying before. By the way, thanks again, of course, also to the EU. The EU supported us, and it's just one like this, and one initiative, and it had significant impact. Small amount of money. But for me, just picking on the theme of the World Public Forum, and my brother has mentioned it. Africa now has that opportunity, has that potential. Yeah, you had the statistic about the deposits of critical resources for renewables. This is now, for me, an important opportunity for the trigger to flow investments towards renewable value chains. Yeah, and for me, that's really key. Yeah, if then within that addressing capacity, we are able to move from the critical raw materials to produce the different components. The demand for batteries, for example, is going to be just outrageously very high. So isn't that an opportunity that actually a number of the components required to manufacture batteries are found within a number of the African countries? That's an opportunity that should actually draw investments towards that. And it could be done now within the FCFTA in a regional setup. And that would, of course, address the need for renewable products, including even green fuels, hydrogen, and so forth. Some of the African countries have already made efforts in that. Yeah. And even green agriculture. Yeah, the electric appliances required for cold storage and so forth, and stuff like that, still are part of that value chain. And the critical resources are really available. So for me, the message then is this an opportunity which is different from probably the earlier decades of the collaboration and cooperation, because this makes business sense. It makes business sense not only for Africa, it makes a business sense for any investor anywhere in the world that thinks that believes in the green transition, because then the money is there. The money is in these value chains. So for me, that's an important message that we need to drum and to get the attention of the key decision makers that then will unlock these investments into these regional value chains. And then, of course, within that, we need to build capabilities. Yeah. So it becomes a win-win. Yeah, in my perspective. And it's a shorter way to achieve what we want. Yeah. So for me, that's my parting message. Thank you very much.
Very well put. Thank you very much. So it's been an interesting discussion. We've started with, I think, the enormity of the challenge before us, 75% of the EU's emissions and the energy transition there, the huge increase in energy demand we're likely to see in Kenya. We've talked through, I think, how each of those governments have tried to meet that growing demand and those pressures. We've talked also about how difficult it can be to make some difficult trade-offs, right? And to address the challenges, not just in responding to short-term pressures, the demand for transport and personal transport, and how you fuel that if fossil fuels are your easiest option. We've talked also about the longer-term objectives, right? Building renewable energy value chains, taking advantage of Africa's potential as a producer of renewable energy, but also about the difficulties, just in a very bureaucratic sense, because this is a policy forum, of encouraging policymakers from very different areas to talk to each other, right? And the very specific question I thought about getting finance and trade ministers together was sort of the apex of that particular challenge. But we've also talked, and this is perhaps where the Kenya EU EPA is an interesting example, is that it seems that leadership from the very top helped to break through the silos, helped to establish that level of ambition, which then shapes what policymakers have to deliver on. So again, I think a lot of it comes back to the question of leadership and the question of vision. In particular, it was a particularly visionary exercise to pull this particular session together and these particular panelists. So a sincere thanks to the government of Kenya and to the EU Commission and the mission here for pulling it together. Sincere thanks from me as your moderator to all of you for your very thoughtful responses to my questions, which not all of which had been agreed in advance. So thank you for bearing with me. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you to those of you online as well. And please join me in a round of applause for our panelists for their excellent performance. Thank you.